Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first literary conversation of 2021, Intersections. My name is Shahenda Helmi, and I am the programs director at Penn Faulkner, and it is my absolute honor to welcome you all here tonight. For those of you joining us for the first time, the Penn Faulkner Foundation is a literary nonprofit based in Washington, D.C., and our mission is to celebrate literature and foster connections between readers and writers to enrich and inspire both individuals and communities. We fulfill our mission by administering 2 annual literary awards, the Penn Malamud Award for Excellence in the Short Story and the Penn Faulkner Award for Fiction, as well as through our many education programs which bring free books and author visits into DC public and public charter schools. We are very proud to be able to continue our work virtually during this pandemic and have been committed to increasing accessibility to our events by adopting a pay-what-you-will model for our literary conversations. If you are able and haven't already, please consider making a donation to Penn Faulkner through the link that we'll put up in the chat shortly. Any amount that you give will help us to continue to provide high quality programming throughout this pandemic and beyond. So thank you in advance for your donations. I'd also like to take a quick moment and thank the National Museum of Women in the Arts for partnering with us on tonight's event. The NMWA is the only major museum in the world that is solely dedicated to championing women through the arts. The museum itself is here in Washington, D.C., and is an absolutely fascinating place to visit. So make sure you check out their online programming in the meantime and give them a visit when it is safe to do so. Before I get started and introduce tonight's panelists, I want to just go over a couple of housekeeping notes about the event. There will be a short Q&A session at the end of the program, so please submit your questions using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. You can also upvote and comment on your favorite questions, and we'll do our best to get to as many as we can in the time that we have. All right, without further ado, I am very excited to introduce tonight's fantastic panelists. We are joined by Tope Folarin, a Nigerian-American writer based in Washington, D.C., and the author of A Particular Kind of Black Man. Tope has won the Caine Prize for African Writing, was named a writer to watch by the New York Times, and among the most promising African writers under 40 by the Hay Festival's Africa 39 initiative. Also on the panel tonight is Min Jin Lee, national bestselling author of Pachinko and Free Food for Millionaires. Pachinko, which was a finalist for the National Book Award, has been translated into 30 languages and has been ordered to series a television adaptation by Apple, which is very exciting. Min also serves as a trustee of PEN America, a director of the Authors Guild, and is on the National Advisory Board of Immigration Initiative at Harvard. We are also honored to have Scottish-American writer Douglas Stuart, author of Shuggie Bain, which won the Booker Prize and was a finalist for the National Book Award, the Kirkus Prize, and many other awards and accolades. He wrote Shuggie Bain over a 10-year period and is currently working on his second novel, Loch Awe. Finally, leading tonight's discussion is the amazing Bethanne Patrick, author and book critic, not to mention Penn Faulkner Vice President and Programs Committee Chair. Bethanne's work frequently appears in the Washington Post, the LA Times, NPR Books, and LitHub. That's it from me. Thank you all again so much for joining us tonight, and I hope you enjoy the program. Bethanne and everyone else, please take it away.
Thank you, Shahenda, so much. And thank you all for being here with us this evening. So excited as the lights go up and our authors join me on screen. This is just a wonderful event. And I also want to thank the National Museum of Women in the Arts so much for working on this particular panel with us, because intersections and intersectionality have so much to do with the lives of women and femmes in the world today. So intersectionality, I just want to say a word or two about it before I begin our conversation. It's a theory of multidimensional oppression and empowerment, because social identities that intersect and overlap can be both. So I think the best way to introduce it is with some words from the woman who coined the term, Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw, who in 1989 defined intersectionality as a lens through which you can see where power comes and collides, where it locks and intersects. It is the acknowledgement that everyone has their own unique experience of discrimination and privilege. I think this is something that the books our authors here have written really it really resonates with those. So I want to ask each of you to talk a little bit about where you see intersectionality occurring in your lives, and how you became aware of the idea, even if you didn't know the term intersectionality, but you saw that there was a little place where things were pushing together and making something different for you. It might have been positive, it might have been negative. Often intersectionality is a difficult thing. So Douglas, would you start, please?
Yeah, that's a brilliant question. I think I've always felt fairly liminal, which is quite a strange thing, I think, for a white Scottish man to say. But growing up sort of poor in Glasgow and queer in a city that was very sort of run by the patriarchy, it's a very hard drinking, hard working, hard loving city. There was really no place for me as a young man. And as that sort of grew in my life, and actually through my literary career, when I wanted to sort of go on and study English as a young man, I never was encouraged toward that because I came from the wrong social class. And so actually writing Shuggie was about reclaiming all those bits of myself that were never quite enough. Even my regional accent as a young man was never seen as something that would cut across things or be acceptable in certain circles. So I was forever code switching or shifting myself depending on the audience it was. And so I guess intersectionality for me comes at the sort of the struggle at trying to accept myself and trying to pull all these little bits of myself that never felt enough and pulling them into a complete human being.
Thank you. That is such an interesting juxtaposition of lots of different things. And one of those threads that I want to pull and connect, Tope, with you is the idea of needing to speak a certain way. Because in a particular kind of Black man, this is something that comes up frequently for your protagonist. His father wants his sons to be able to at least sound like the ruling class. Is that a fair assessment? And how does that work with your experience of pushing up against intersections?
It's a great question, and I actually agree with a lot of what Douglas said. So the protagonist of my novel is in a position in which he's trying to simultaneously reckon with who he is, right? To become a full human being, which is the task that all of us, I think, in our own ways are engaged in. And it's a task that's made much more difficult for him because he's a person of color in a place that's predominantly white. And so you have the clash of the kind of external expectation of the kind of person he's supposed to be, and then of something that's blossoming within him that in many ways contradicts that. The question that my protagonist has to grapple with, that I've grappled with throughout the course of my life, is how do you meld these two things? And is it possible to do so? Because one potential path, if you attempt to integrate these kind of sort of things that can't be integrated, is something close to insanity, right? And that's why a number of people that I've loved dearly, have succumbed to something like that, because they've determined that it's impossible to reconcile who they are with who society wishes them to be. And that resonates too with me as an artist. I think that my charge as an artist is to be as radical and honest as I can be. And in attempting to do that, I'm also reckoning with a literary culture that perhaps doesn't want that or desire that or doesn't even understand that, right? I think that many artists of color recognize that in order for their work to be acceptable to people, it has to be accessible, right? Because if it isn't accessible, then nobody will read it. And by nobody, I mean the sort of the gatekeepers, the folks who are in charge of publishing the work. And so the question becomes, as an artist who's deeply interested in innovation and being radical, is to what extent can I be fooling myself on the page and still sort of have a pathway into publishing and have a pathway into literary success? So in many ways, that kind of struggle echoes and rhymes with the journey that my protagonist goes on in terms of searching for his identity.
I'm smiling and nodding wildly because Tope, you're bringing up things I want to talk about and questions that I have. And not that we can't talk about them now. It's just so great because we really are involved in a conversation here. And Min, I want to have you answer the question that Douglas and Tope have just talked about where you've experienced intersectionality and how you see it in terms of both discrimination and privilege, because particularly in Free Food for Millionaires, I saw some instances where characters really did use intersections in their lives to gain privilege, for sure. And it's so often that we talk about intersections as being about oppression. And it's not that the good things necessarily aren't about oppression either, but I will stop talking and let you speak.
Actually, I love what you just said. And, I'm 52 years old, so I feel really privileged to say intersectionality is something that I grew up with. So in 1989, when it came out with Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw, who I really want to honor, especially during Black History Month, hello, is that, and I also got to study with bell hooks.
Oh.
So in my experience of studying with bell hooks for 2 years and also studying with and learning about Dr. Crenshaw as the idea was blooming, for me, it was really a form of empowerment. So I think politicization is very often very linked with oppression. And I think recognizing oppression is incredibly important. And yet I also think that being politicized made me realize how fun and cool and privileged I am because I have this power to resist. So if someone doesn't tell you that you have the power to resist, you think that, oh, I just have to sort of like suck it up and take it. And I think I'm well aware that suffering is important, but I'm also really aware of like, how do I get what I want? And I think that learning how to be ambitious, that was something that I didn't get as a child. Like as a child, it wasn't like somebody was telling me, oh, when you grow up, go get what you want. Nobody said that to me. And nobody said, oh, go and learn how to talk or to assert what you want or to disagree. All those things I wasn't taught. So in a way, being politicized, even knowing that there was a structural problem, was actually a form of opening doors and windows and roofs. And I think it's amazing. And as a matter of fact, I talk to my students all the time about intersectionality, of how it can be a way to claim power by recognizing that there's something wrong, rather than thinking there's something wrong with you.
Well, that's exactly it. It can be an empowering thing. And Tope, what you just said, I would love to hear Min and Douglas respond to that. The idea of being an artist, just being someone who's trying to create, is a difficult intersection for almost all of us, right? It doesn't matter how you've grown up. There are very few parents, there are a few bohemian families who say, go for it, honey. You'll be able to live on some top ramen. And, I had an old music teacher who would make like ketchup soup out of packets and hot water and season it with salt and pepper. We all know that if we're willing to endure extreme poverty, we can go for just anything. But many of your characters and many of us who are living as artists want to also maybe we don't care about being terribly rich, maybe we don't care about luxuries, maybe we do, but the fact is choosing art makes it more difficult.
Yeah, I will just jump in very briefly here and say, yeah, that's definitely the case. And I think it's even, I'm looking for the right word here, it's probably even worse for writers of color, because it's difficult for any artist to make it, right? Like, we've all seen the movies and read the plays and read the stories about the artists who's struggling to make it. But think about being a writer of color or a visual artist of color and recognizing that the pathway is incredibly difficult. Yes. And at the same time, you're trying to introduce something that may be new to folks who haven't interacted with someone like you before. So not only are you thinking about poverty, you're thinking about an even longer stretch of sort of being isolated or being ignored or whatever the case may be. And that's the risk you take on when you're trying to sort of create, and you're not operating from the center of the literary universe in a certain way, right? So that's something that I think we need to grapple with as well.
We definitely need to scrapple with that. Min, how about your idea of being an artist and how what Tope just said about the stories not always being familiar? I think all three of your books, all four of them complete right now, do have some of this in some way.
Oh my goodness. It's funny because if I had to list all of my weird identities, it's really long. And I have a lot of surprises. People are like, what? You're a Presbyterian? You grew up working class and you're a feminist and you're progressive and you're a Presbyterian. That's weird. And I kind of think, I know. but at the same time, I kind of think it's like a different window. And I think that's the reason why I write community novels. I'll always write community novels. I'll always write omniscient, because I kind of think every corner is really interesting to me. And I feel like I can see myself deeply in that person. And as for being an artist, it's always been really, really hard. But I think that if you are working class, if you are immigrant, if you are female, if you are Presbyterian, whatever, it's like a very, very strange thing. And then I used to think, I don't know what you guys think, because you guys are writers. I used to think, oh, if I meet the right Korean people, I'm going to find my people.
Yeah.
I used to think, oh, if I meet the right feminist, I'm going to find my people. If I meet the right people from Queens, from Elmhurst, like I'm going to meet my people. And then I kept on having a series of heartbreaks. And I realized, no, I just belong with people who are artists, who are misfits like me. And then we're going to kind of get along. And then I realized, like, oh, then my world just got bigger. It didn't get smaller. It actually just got much bigger. And then I felt better. So this is, again, intersectionality. You can actually have a bigger group.
The first, and Douglas, I want to hear from you, but I just want to make sure that I say this. I had the same kinds of feelings, oh, if I find the right, for me, it was Episcopalians. If I find the right Episcopalians, if I find the right, people at college or in grad school, if I find the right medievalists, because I was a medievalist. So
right. As one is, yes.
As one is. But no, I didn't find the right anything until I went to my first associated writing programs, or AWP conference, and realized, as you did, Min, that my people are writers and artists and creatives. And so I do think that is something many of us have in common. And as you said, it makes the world larger. Did you find that, Douglas? That your world expanded when you decided, that's it, I'm giving myself over to this enormous task of writing this big, fat book?
I actually think that I loved what Min said there, but I actually think I sat down to write the book in order to make sense of the different parts of myself. I think in a lot of ways I couldn't find the right language to explain myself, and I was shifting. The prism of me was turning so frequently to whoever I was facing that actually I found literature a great way to pull together all the complex parts of my life and what I felt and all the different people I felt I was inside myself. Even thinking about sort of the boy that grew up in poverty in Glasgow, that was a queer kid that was pushed aside by sort of the men in my world, and then the guy who ended up in New York working for these huge fashion brands, who had sort of transcended many social classes and was really sort of at the height of his creative career. These two things didn't sit together. And so really writing Shuggie for me was about pulling all those parts of myself together and putting it into this document in many ways. But actually, even the intersection of my creative lives, because I had spent many years trying to come around and find a place for myself in writing, because it was something I had to come to in my adult life. But as soon as I did that, and as soon as I started to sit at the page and write, I actually pulled all of my other creative skills with me. And so my ability with textiles, with fashion, my visual arts were actually when I realized that was where my seat of strength lay, that was an intersection in my life that I wanted to bring to my writing and sort of amplify.
Well, actually, I was going to have Tope read first, but now, because of that answer, Douglas, would you please read to us from Shuggie Bain? And this is early in the book. I'll let you set it up, but I'm so glad you chose this particular scene.
Sorry, Tope. Yes, this is actually a scene from the beginning of the book when we just meet our calamitous heroine, Agnes, who is the proud, defiant mother of the Bain family. She's a wonderful woman. She is a working class woman. She's incredibly glamorous, incredibly proud, very inventive, but she is chafing at the smallness of her life. She has married the wrong man, and all of her very humble, realistic dreams are not going to be met. The world often sees her as being too much, and in fact, it's the world around her that's not enough. But she is at a card party in one of the, what we Americans would call housing projects in the scheme. The women cackled without breaking their concentration on the cards. It was sweaty and close in the front room. Agnes watched her mammy, little Lizzie, carefully studying her hand, flanked by the bulk of Nan Flanagan on one side and Reenie Sweeney on the other. The women sat thigh to thigh and tore at the last scraps of a fish supper. They were moving coins and folding cards with greasy fingers. Anne-Marie Easton, the youngest amongst them, was concentrating on rolling mean-looking cigarettes of loose tobacco on her skirt. The women spilt their housekeeping money on the low tea table and were pushing 5 and 10 pence bets back and forward. It bored Agnes. There was a time before baggy cardigans and skinny husbands that she had led them all up to the dancing. As girls, they had clung to one another like a string of pearls and sang at the top of their voices all the way down Sucky Hall Street. They had been underage, but Agnes, sure of herself even at 15, knew she would get them in. The doorman always saw her gleaming at the back of the line and beckoned her forward, and she pulled the other girls behind her like a chain gang. They held on to the belt of her coat and muttered protest, but Agnes just smiled her best smile for the doorman, the smile she kept for men, the same one she hid from her mother. She had loved to show off her smile back then. She got her teeth from her daddy's side, and the Campbell teeth had always been weak. They were a reason for humility in an otherwise handsome face. Her own adult teeth had come in small and crooked, and even when they were new, they'd never been white because of the smoking and her mammy's strong tea. At 15, she had begged Lizzie to let her have them all taken out. The discomfort of the false teeth was nothing when compared to the movie star smile she thought they must give her. Each new tooth was broad and even and as straight as Elizabeth Taylor's. Agnes sucked at her porcelain. Now here they were, every Friday night, these same women playing cards in her mammy's front room. There was not a single drop of makeup between them. Nobody had much of a heart to sing anymore. Thank you.
Thank you so much. You feel that you're in the front room. And one thing I want everyone to know is that there is this wonderful action that comes, I believe, just after, where the women have ordered all kinds of different brassieres from a catalog, and they try them on over their clothes and then keep them on while they're playing cards. And of course, Agnes is just appalled by her mother, doing something like this. And I think so many of us who have lives that are different from our parents know what it's like to just be absolutely appalled by that parental, not just the difference, but especially if they're enjoying the difference. Especially if Lizzie is just having a grand time, that is just awful, and so I think that intersectionality, one of the things that really fascinates me about it is it does raise possibilities where we can figure out where we don't have a good understanding of others, where we don't have the resources or the information or the compassion to help people. And so I know that there are people who also argue, and I don't want to get into politics too much, but I know some people say, oh, well, intersectionality, shows special treatment for certain groups. I'm just saying that to give a nod to the fact that there's another side. I'm much more interested in how your characters and your stories point up those places where someone can learn something about someone else, where someone can help someone else. So anything that brings up for any of you about your books.
Well,
Yeah.
oh,
Go ahead.
Oh, no, you
Go ahead,
please.
Tope.
I've spoken, Tope.
No, I was going to say very quickly that I think in many ways that's my art is kind of obsessed with that question, because I'm convinced as a human being that we can't ever really fully know others if we don't fully know ourselves, and so it's sort of taking that journey and being unafraid of doing that that I'm concerned with. And I guess it sounds simple, but it's maybe one of the hardest things you can do is to kind of really reckon with yourself, to kind of, I guess one way of thinking about it is just sort of standing naked in a mirror and saying, this is who I am. Let me reckon with this fully, right? I'm kind of encouraged to not do that, to kind of obscure the various parts of ourselves that for whatever reason we don't like or we don't want to reckon with. And but I'm convinced that one has to undertake that journey in order to kind of, because what you'll discover if you really begin to reckon with yourself and reconcile yourself to the parts of yourself that you might not like, is that you might recognize those parts of yourself in other people, right? And you might say, okay, I can fully sort of engage with this person as a fellow human being because I see parts of them in myself and vice versa. And let's begin this hard journey of attempting to create community, even in a space and environment where that seems to be incredibly difficult.
I don't, thank you so much for that, Tope. And Min, I don't want to keep ignoring Pachinko. So bring Pachinko into this. It's just that I read Free Food more recently.
Oh, no. Actually, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Oh, good. Oh, good. You don't mind talking about it then.
Oh, no, I'm actually writing a script right now on Free Food. So it's very top of mind, even though it's an old book of mine. But actually, I wanted to talk about Douglas's reading, if that's okay.
Oh, yeah, go ahead.
Why not? Because I'm also a critic, so. But in a good way.
Yeah.
Instant criticism
tonight.
No. But this is literary criticism, because I think one of the things that's really powerful about intersectionality is that when you have writers who really embrace their background, and also the intimacy of that background. One of the things that's happening in Stuart's work, in Douglas Stuart's work, I just started to write it I just started to type.
Oh, it's all Scottish.
Yes, Douglas Stuart's work is that in all the descriptions, what you see is the beauty and poverty, the appreciation of beauty and poverty. It's not just poverty. It's not just the difficulty and the embarrassment and the awkwardness of what's going on, but what you have is design. And you also have beauty, like you have the pearls, you have the thigh to thigh. And in that description, you have the recognition that the narrator has great sympathy for people. Just because they don't have money, it doesn't mean that they don't have style or a sense of beauty or aesthetics, or an appreciation for that which is rich and glorious. That's not the exclusive province of the rich. And I think
affection.
Or affection, of course, and intimacy. And I think for me, like that is incredibly empowering about the idea of intersectionality, because it gives you the ability to say, the way we've been presented is so wrong. The way we've been represented is so wrong, because actually all of us, no matter what our class station or race or gender or sexual identity or ability, we have actually all these expansive, glorious parts of ourselves that you're not allowing us to express. And that's the reason why I think it's so important to have access to publication, access to sharing and disseminating our ideas, because we have been shut out for a very, very long time.
That is something that I think is really important, because well, I have another quote to read if you all will put up with me. It's from Audre Lorde, the great poet and activist. And she says, from my membership in all of these groups, Black, lesbian, feminist, socialists, poet, mother, I have learned that oppression and the intolerance of difference come in all shapes and sexes and colors and sexualities. And that among those of us who share the goals of liberation and a workable future for our children, there can be no hierarchies of oppression. I have learned that sexism and heterosexism both arise from the same source as racism. And that's from There Is No Hierarchy of Oppressions. I found that incredibly powerful. And with what you were just saying about Douglas's work, Min, if you can show compassion for a group, that comes from the same source also. Racism and sexism come from this source of hatred, and compassion and, recognition of difference come from this source of love. And I just want to get into the literary culture and publishing. And with that, Tope, I'm going to have you give your reading.
Sure. Yeah, I was just going to say something very quickly in response to that quote.
Course.
I think it's really powerful. And I think also what it signals is that in so many ways, we're moving towards a literature of disparate parts, right? From away from a literature that kind of emphasizes this notion that you can be a kind of, what I'll call like white male literature, the kind of literature that I grew up reading in school, which posits that, you can be this fully fleshed human being who kind of traipses around and conquers the world, or whatever, that narrative may be. Now, as we kind of proceed in the 21st century, it seems like a literature of parts becomes more appropriate, because it's about recognizing all of those sort of parts that we're made up of, right? And sort of not de-emphasizing one at the expense of another, or whatever, or saying that this is fully who I am. And I think you see that in all kinds of ways in the kind of literature that we're seeing that's published, people kind of emphasizing those parts and shoving it into the work, even if it's messy, even if it doesn't make complete sense, but insisting on its presence there, I think is deeply important. So I'm not sure if that's a prelude to my reading, but I wanted to say it nonetheless.
Let's let it be. I love that.
Exactly. So I'll just read from the first couple pages of my novel.
Thank you.
Yeah. She told me I could serve her in heaven. She accompanied me to school each day. School was about a mile away and a few hundred feet into my trek. Just as my family's apartment building drifted out of view behind me, she would appear at my side. I don't remember how she looked. Memory often summons a generic figure in her place. An elderly white woman with frizzled gray hair, slightly bent over, a smile featuring an assortment of gaps and silver linings. I do remember her touch, however. It felt cool and papery, disarmingly comfortable on the hottest days of fall. She would often pat my head as we walked together, and a penetrating silence would cancel the morning sounds around us. I felt comfortable, protected somehow in her presence. She never walked all the way to school with me, but her parting words were always the same. Remember, if you are a good boy here on earth, you can serve me in heaven. I was 5 years old. Her words sounded magical to me, vast and alluring. I didn't know her. I barely knew her name, but the offer she held out to me each morning seemed far too generous to dismiss lightly. In class, I would think about what servitude in heaven would be like. I imagined myself carrying buckets of water for her on streets of gold, rubbing her feet as angels sang praises in the background. I imagined that I'd have my own heavenly shack. I'd have time to do my own personal heavenly things as well. How else would I get to heaven? One day I told my father about her offer. We were talking about heaven, a favorite subject of his, and I mentioned that I already had a place there. I've already found someone to serve, I said. What do you mean? Dad smiled warmly at me. I felt his love. I repeated myself. Daddy, I'm going to heaven. And how are you going to get there? He said. I told him about the old lady, my heavenly shack, the streets of gold. My father stared at me a moment, grief and sadness surging briefly to the surface of his face, and then anger. He leaned forward, stared into my eyes. Listen to me now. The only person you will serve in heaven is God. You will serve no one else. Thanks.
Thank you, Tope. And I think it's important for everyone to know about that powerful passage is that, of course, young Tunde has just met his first Mormon, And at the time, I'm not going to pretend to know a lot about Mormon theology or dogma, but at the time, many people who were Mormons believed that a person of color could not go to heaven except as a servant of a white person.
Yeah, you couldn't ascend to the highest level of heaven
Yes.
without sort of accompanying some white, I guess we'll call them heavenly sponsor or something. So.
This old woman with papery hands, heavenly sponsors. What was going through her head? That's the thing that comes back to me in having read that scene and then hearing you speak it, is you, and I think this is something many of us who have seen someone be racist, is what was going through her head. Like, really, she thought that people who had a different skin color were meant to be her servant. It just, I don't know.
From her perspective, it's a gift. And that's the thing that's really, it's a gift she's offering this young boy. She's like, I want to help you out. And the biggest, most impactful, glorious thing I can give you is this opportunity to serve me for eternity. And so it's a kind of insidious way that racism sometimes works. If it's kind of embedded in the psyche of somebody, that can be a legitimate way of expressing love in a way.
Who believes it's a gift. Yeah. Exactly. It's in the novels that all three of you have written, there are hierarchies of oppression being addressed. But the literary world, and this is something Tope has touched on already, and the literary world includes writing, but also publishing and book selling, has supported many of these hierarchies for a long time. So let's really get into it. Let's just dish. Do you individually, together, believe change is happening? And is it change that seeps into our culture at large? Is that like a too big a question? Do I need to draw it back?
I'm happy to step into the breach,
Please go.
And potentially say something that'll get me in trouble, but it is what it is. I think that things are changing. I'm sure a lot of people had the chance to read the Vulture piece about American Dirt that was published, I think, about a month ago, that kind of, spilled the beans on what happened around the publication of that book. And over the course of the past year, we've seen a number of people of color ascend to like really high positions in publishing. And I think that's a really wonderful, positive development. But we still kind of inhabit this space where the most popular Netflix film after George Floyd was murdered was The Help, right? And I think one reason that's the case is because it provides this entry point for people who aren't necessarily accustomed to thinking about the lives of other people. I mean, it provides this entry point to say, here's what they may be experiencing. The only caveat that I think needs to be attached to this wonderful development that, all these people of color are ascending to these wonderful heights, is that they're still operating within a framework in which the kind of American Dirt thing can still happen. Right. I have to say personally that when my book was out, that there were a couple, I can't be too specific here, but there were a couple, Black editors who saw the work, and they both had a similar comment. They didn't think it would work in the marketplace. And so I wonder the extent to which Black editors are still operating with that logic, because they still have this mandate to make money for their publishing house. And their publishing houses are still operating under this belief that only a certain kind of book can do well on the market, which means they're not going to give the marketing support to other books, right? So one really needs to break the system in a certain way before we begin to see the kind of radical works of art that I think will have a profound impact on our country and our society and the world at large. And I'm hoping that happens in the very near future.
Amen to that. Comments on what Tope just said, Douglas or Min, from you, or I can start twisting, words to my evil purposes. Not yours, not your words.
I mean, I have been writing for much less time than Min and Tope, and so I can only speak from a very personal point of view, but I was struck when Shuggie was sent out for publication at the rejections it received, not by the rejections, that's part of a writer's life, but how people didn't know how the publishing houses didn't know how to market it to people. They didn't know what shelf to put it on, where it fit in, who would want to hear about this Scottish family. And even with a book that is 500 pages and I think covers quite a lot of humanity, they were trying to reduce it to what it was really truly about. And that is almost the opposite of what we're talking about today, right? That's reductive. And the thing that I think has been surprising about Shuggie, and has taken a lot of people in publishing industry by surprise, is how much people can relate to the book, how much humanity crosses all of us. And even though this is a family all the way over there in Scotland, we can understand the love and the hope and the desperation and the wants and how women might feel and how young queer boys might feel. And that's been the universal part of it, or the intersectionality of it, I guess, how it relates to everybody. And the publishing industry didn't see that in the book. They only saw which shelf it would go on and what book it was like that had come before.
Min, how about you? And clearly, you know, and sorry, Tope, I did not pulled up.
Oh, there it is.
There it is. Hey, a particular kind of Black man. There we go. But you know, clearly your books have been very, very successful and people are relating to them. But did you feel that it was difficult to get the publishing world to understand what you were trying to do?
Well, it's very funny, but because it took me 11 years to publish my first book, right? And because I had nothing but rejections, and then I had a terrible experience with publishing my first book because my editor actually quit before the paperback. And then I had to move to Japan. So the publication cycle really hurt. And I think that for me, that experience of having, you know, incredible reviews and then all of a sudden losing the house support because I lost my editor. And then that actually happened to me with Pachinko as well.
Oh my goodness.
So then I think what ended up happening was I've always written about people who don't get help. Like I was kind of born thinking, I'm on my own, I'm gonna have to figure this out. You know, like my parents aren't gonna help me, you know, like I'm just gonna have to figure
Vegetarian or not.
Right, I'm just gonna have to figure this out. It's me and God. So I think what ended up happening is I just did not, I think I went to every single book club that asked on my own steam, on my own steam. And when the publisher, and also I started to understand that everybody in publishing is perfectly well-minded. Everybody's well-intentioned. I mean, it's really a nice little world. I mean, I've been into other worlds. Like I've studied Wall Street, I've studied investment banking, I've studied law, I've studied Hollywood. Like it's not nice out there. Publishing people are actually pretty nice people. And then I started to understand, oh, a publicist at an in-house publisher has to be responsible for 20 books. How in the world can they possibly do this, right? And then they might only have 3 chits. So for example, for Pachinko, I was reviewed, and nobody understands it, but if you look it up, you'll realize that historically I'm accurate. It was reviewed by the New York Times, and it was reviewed by San Francisco Chronicle. If you look at the Washington Post, for example, it was, the audiobook was reviewed and it has 1 paragraph.
Wow.
That's it.
Wow.
No Wall Street Journal, nothing else. And USA Today came through. So those are those, so I had the New York Times, which is, you know, grand, but it wasn't like, you know, first page or anything. And then I had, and the reason why I'm sharing all this with you is because people always go like, oh my gosh, you had this great publishing success. It came out in February 2007. I had exactly those 2 reviews, and the San Francisco Chronicle came in later. I didn't get anything else. And then in the UK, they did some good reviews, and that kind of carried over to the US.
Interesting.
Right.
This goes into one of the things I wanted to ask is that in our culture, there are a lot of people I know who will read stories, thick novels, about things that they don't believe in, will not accept, can't understand. So this kind of goes to what you all have said. I think fiction has a particularly important role in disseminating ideas about intersectionality, opening up discussions about intersectionality. And it's very interesting to me that someone will pick up, Shuggie Bain, and they probably in their, daytime life don't talk about alcoholism or poverty or
Scotland.
Or Scotland, yeah, or anything, And they read this book and in maybe in their book club or whatever, but they will take it in. I know so many people who seem very rigid and very stuck in their particular intersection who will read fiction that goes way, way beyond their own experience. And so, go ahead, Min.
No, I want to interrupt you here because I guess my little tiny point is, even though initially I didn't have this sort of critical support in the US, what I did decide to do, because my husband lost his job like right on the day of my publication of Pachinko. It was actually like I went to Barnes and Noble to do my, what do call that, the kickoff, the kickoff event. And my husband met me in the afternoon right before I walked into the green room for Barnes Noble because I lost my job today. And I was like, fuck, and I had already lost my editor. So then I thought, oh my gosh, I got to sell this book. What am I going to do? Because if I don't sell this book and those numbers are shitty, I'm in trouble. So I just started to accept every single offer to like read anywhere. Like I would have read in a street corner. And I'm really, really shy because I was like, we have no health insurance. Our son was in college. It was like terrifying. But the thing that I wanted to say is, if it wasn't for readers who said, I read this book, I liked it, and they gave it to somebody else, I would have been totally fucked. I mean, pardon my French, but it was really readers. So if readers read your book and they like it, they will get excited and they will tell other people. And readers saved my bacon.
Well, and that is readers, readers connecting with these stories, I hope makes a difference in how they look at people, how they treat people. I think it does. It's hard to say. It's it's really, is it fair to say, evanescent things? It's hard to hold on to, seeing someone read a story, the story about Tunde, who has so much to overcome. And one of the things, Tope, that you talk about, we're talking about, different kinds of intersectionality, is seeing a family where mental illness, not that there isn't mental illness in the other books, but in a particular kind of Black man, we have this mother who just sort of sinks into herself and she's never well again. That is not a spoiler. That is just an important part of life. And so I'm wondering about how the literary world allows not just stories of difference, but stories of really hard things that are different. Some difference you can see, other difference is more difficult to write about and to explain. So does that make sense? Is that something that...
Yeah, no, look, when I was writing, I started writing this book in 2010, I think. And so one of the things it was published in 2019. So I guess if we share anything, it's like kind of this long gestation period for our books. And one of the things that I was thinking about the entire time was like because my parents are from Nigeria. So much of the book is in its own way kind of autobiographical. And whenever I was thinking about, sort of what had happened to me and how to transpose that or translate that into fiction, I was thinking about like how honest I wanted to be about certain painful things and also the way those painful things were perceived. Because in this context, for example, by this context, I mean the United States of America, the West, whatever you want to call it, we think about mental illness in a very particular way. It's this condition that you might have. If you're fortunate enough to have medical insurance, you can go to a doctor or you can go to some professional and get some help for it. In the context that my parents emerged from, it's a sign of some spiritual demise or something's happening, right? That needs, and you need a spiritual intervention. And I grew up with those two traditions firmly kind of ensconced in my head. And I didn't want to do the thing that I've been encouraged to do in some quarters, which is to kind of like say, okay, like the kind of West African tradition needs to be jettisoned in favor of this other tradition. I
Right.
thought, how interesting would it be to kind of insist on in its own kind of saying that this reality that people in West Africa have is a legitimate way of thinking about the world. And so the kind of thing that I try to do in my book is to kind of insist on putting it in the book in the way that sort of my parents, my extended family members thought about it. And that's
Not
one reason why.
diminishing that.
Sorry?
I'm not diminishing that.
At all, no, to not diminish that. Yeah, to say that, you know, this idea, for example, this idea of multiple realities. Again, here it's a sci-fi fantasy, you know, sort of notion. In other parts of the world, there is a belief that, you know, there are other realities. And so I wanted to kind of just put that into the book, not apologize for it, you know, not explain it away, not medicate it in its own way, but say, you know, this is the way that certain people kind of experience the world, and just put it out there. And I think I was reading a lot of Frantz Fanon and Du Bois when I wrote my book, and I think in their own ways they're also talking about these conditions and ideas. And so I felt empowered when I was writing to kind of when I was being shy, you know, on the page, to say, you know what, let me just go for it and see what happens.
Thank you. You know, I want to have you read, Min, but just before you read, and I don't want to forget, Douglas, to ask this of you in a minute. It seems to me that what Tope is talking about with the West African spiritual tradition is something that comes into your books with the Christian church and its influence on Koreans and Korean Americans. And, you know, in Free Food, certainly there is such an important emphasis on the church. And again, as Tope was saying, you don't diminish it or make fun of it. There are some individual characters who might say, oh, you know, why is she at church all the time, or what have you? But the omniscient perspective allows you to show how important it is to Leah, for example. So would you comment on that for just a moment before you read, please?
Oh, sure. One of the things that I really want to talk about, and I think this is where literary novelists are failing, we're getting an F. We're getting an F on this, is that very often we have such disdain and contempt for religion. And actually, most people in the world have religion. Like, so for example, I think most Western writers fail Islam. We just fail it. We get a big old F. And I kind of think, how could you forget that most people in the world believe in something? Just because most of us don't doesn't necessarily mean that they don't believe in it. And also they find most of their identity in that community. Most people will say, like, I'm a Catholic more than I'm Irish or Italian. And I think I want to respect that. I really want to understand why they feel this way, because it's such an important part of their intersectional identity. So I will always, and also I'm going to say something really, I'm going to get in trouble for saying this, but if you're writing about Koreans and you don't write about the church, you don't know Korean people. Like, it's like you missed a point, because even if you hate Christianity, it's part of their lives. So, I mean, we build churches like 7-Elevens, like that's what we do. You know, in the same way, like I have to write about suicide because Koreans are like constantly thinking or talking about suicide. It's one of the most prevalent, you know, extreme ends of mental illness that happens in the Korean community around the world. So I have to write about it.
So that is really, really telling. You know, if you're not writing about church, you just don't know Koreans. And,
I know.
You know,
I'm gonna get in trouble for saying that. Maybe we can erase that part.
I was about to say, and if you don't write about alcohol, you don't know Glaswegians. But with that, Min, would you read from
Sure.
Pachinko, please?
Yeah, I'm going to read a really, really tiny section. It's very early in the book. It's March 1933. We're in the Busan ferry terminal. The mom is saying goodbye to her daughter, and the daughter's pregnant. It's Yangjin, and it's Sanja. I saw the gold watch in your things, Yangjin said. Was it from that man? Yes. What kind of man can afford something like that? Sanja didn't reply. Where is the man who gave you that watch? He lives in Osaka. But that's where you're going. Are you planning to see him? No. You cannot see this man, Sanja. He abandoned you. He's not good. And Youngjin took her daughter's hand. You cannot see him. That man, Youngjin pointed at Ishak, who was still talking to the immigration officers. That man saved your life. He saved your child. You're a member of his family now. I have no right to see you again. Do you know what that's like for a mother? Soon you'll be a mother. And I hope that you'll have a son who won't have to leave you when he gets married. And Sanja nodded. The watch. What will you do with it? I'll sell it when I get to Osaka. And Youngjin was satisfied with that answer. Save it for an emergency. And if your husband asks where you got it, tell him that I gave it to you. And Youngjin fumbled with the purse tucked beneath her blouse. This belonged to your father's mother. And Youngjin gave her the 2 gold rings her mother-in-law had given to her before she died. Try not to sell these unless you have to. You should have something in case you need money. You're a thrifty girl, but raising a child requires money. There will be things that you can't expect, like doctor's visits. And if it's a boy, you'll need fees for school. And if your husband doesn't give you any money for your household, earn something and put aside savings for emergencies. Spend what you need, but just throw even a few coins into a tin and forget that you have it. A woman should always have something set by. And take good care of your husband. Otherwise, another woman will. And treat your husband's family with reverence. Obey them. And if you make mistakes, they will curse our family. Think of your kind father, who always did his best for us. And Youngjin tried to think of anything else that she was supposed to tell her. But it was so hard to focus. And Sanja slipped the rings into the fabric bag beneath her blouse where she kept her watch and money. Amini, I'm sorry. I know. And Youngjin closed her mouth and she stroked Sanja's hair. You're all I have. And now I have nothing. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Oh, Min. I'm not supposed to cry while I'm moderating.
I always cry at this because it was really hard for me to write that. It was really, really hard for me to write that.
Really, really difficult scene. And talk about intersectionality. If it's a boy, you'll need school fees.
Right. And actually that's really normal. And I believe that what's interesting about sexism, very often it's imparted by women.
Yes.
And I want to be honest about that. Like, it's not always like this man who's like that's enemy, right? It's not always so simple.
No, it isn't. It's internalized. And Tope, you touched on that earlier. And it's also something, Douglas, you touched on when you were talking about, a boy not being accepted by the men in his society, but the men are also taught by the women how to be. And this is exactly part of intersectionality that's so difficult. Is it's not as if we can go to the intersection and unknot it and there we are, we're free. There are a lot of pain points, of trigger points, if you will. I know that we have questions lining up in the queue. There's one more thing I want to talk about now. We can take some questions, and then if we go through them all, probably won't happen, then I'll have a few other questions. But I do want to talk about how intersectionality affects the prose itself and forms. Tope, I'm thinking of the Nellie pages in a particular kind of Black man. I'm thinking of craft books like Meander, Spiral, Explode by Jane Allison, and Matthew Salesi's Craft in the Real World, which just came out. And I'm loving that he is sort of blowing up the idea of workshopping the way it's always been done. And it's not that that is all bad, it's that it needs to be questioned. And so we know that a linear narrative isn't the only way, that intersectionality means we can do things differently. I'm not just talking about chronologically linear, as in, time's arrow flying. I'm talking about, just deciding to, for instance, Douglas, tell a story that is really hard and unrelenting, and not saying, okay, we're going to put a happily ever after here. Is that something that I know in writing, you all took time in writing these novels, but is that something that you specifically thought about in terms of the actual craft of Shuggie Bain?
Absolutely. I thought often, who was I in service to when I was writing the book? And I was always in service to the characters and the life that they were living. And I never thought about the reader. I had no notion of the reader, but even through the editing process, when it came to it, I felt that I had to tell it from their truth. And there was sometimes, voices within me that wanted to turn the narrative a little bit to give some more hope, or to make it not turn out as it wouldn't necessarily be in real life. And that felt like I was letting somebody down. But even when I was writing the book and I was thinking about the voice and the language and how the characters talked and how they spoke to each other, I felt that I had to hold on to that quite firmly, because I felt if I had taken their sense of themselves or their sense of belonging and I corrupted it in some way in order to make them more palatable for other people, then I had let them down.
Thank you. Excellent. Tope, you have definitely got some more experimental elements in, especially the second half of the book.
Yeah.
So, you have some chapters that are just a line or two. You had, as I said, the Nellie pages where Tunde is saying a name again and again and again. And those are all really important to the narrative. These aren't just, sort of, I don't know, it's not just something whimsical. It's something you had to think about deeply. So you comment on that, on bringing in those elements in a book, as you said, that you already knew was going to have its hurdles.
Yeah. Well, I'm obsessed with craft and structure, and I wanted to tell a story structurally at the same time I was telling a story with the prose. And one of the things that I sort of came to me was that I wanted to start the book in a quote unquote conventional way, and to kind of, provide an access point to a reader who doesn't know a great deal about the kind of character I'm writing about. But then as the character begins to reckon with himself, the book does as well. And the book kind of decides, I can't be a conventional sort of linear narrative, because that's not the kind of life I'm depicting. And so the book begins to break apart at a certain point. And there was something I went back and forth with my publisher about, which was at the middle part of the book, I wanted to kind of have a middle passage, to kind of reverse the middle passage we think about a lot. And my way of doing that on the page was to kind of strip away, typically books have the name of the book and the author on the top of the page. And I said, let's strip all of that away. Let's just have this a dialogue-based sort of back and forth with the protagonist and his love interest, because he's discovering as he falls in love that he's discovering more about himself. He's getting stripped away. Everything that all the defenses that he's kind of constructed over the course of his life aren't really effective in this phase of falling in love. So it's also a kind of middle passage back to his true self, if you will. And so that was really important for me to figure out how to do that structurally. And then at the end of my book, and I'm not giving anything away when I say this, the last chapter is composed of earlier parts of the book. It's kind of collage. I copied earlier chapters, earlier descriptions, and I put them all. And the structural point at the end is that he is made up of disparate parts. He's discovered a way to become whole by integrating every sort of other part out there that didn't make sense to him and didn't make sense to a lot of people who met him. And he's discovered a way, the last word of my book is home. He's discovered a way to make a home by fully embracing all of these weird out there parts of himself. And so it was really important. I'm obsessed with visual art, I have to say, especially the art of the 1920s and Surrealism and Dadaism. Spent a lot of time thinking about the development of Cubism and what that represented, a kind of sort of fracture in the history of visual art. And I spent a lot of time looking at paintings and thinking about like how, as artists like Braque and Picasso begin to develop Cubism, what they're doing is they're dealing with the entire history of Western art, but they're also kind of breaking it up and saying, as we enter this 20th century, we have to create something new that accounts for where we are in life right now. And so I have to admit that my ambition was to try to do something in my own way similar in my book. So.
But Tope, who won on those middle pages?
Oh, I did. So I wanted to strip away. Look, I had two requests. First of all, I'm not going to italicize any non-English word. And so to their credit, they were down with that. And second, and we went back and forth with this because it was an unconventional request. And I actually wanted to go more radical. I wanted to strip away page numbers. I said page numbers are a way of kind of acceding to this idea that time, works in a linear way. And they're like, no, Tope, page numbers. So I said, okay. I said, okay.
Oh, you had to compromise.
Like you're losing the fly.
Anyone who is writing a novel is grappling with intersectionality because, it comes from a cishet white male tradition in so many ways. Not that that is necessarily the complete genesis of fiction. We don't need to go into a history of literature right now. We don't have the time, but with at least the 21st century, we're still working within parameters that, as all of you have acknowledged, were put together by white men in New York, London. Let's face it, New York, London, Paris, Munich. Everybody's talking about pop music. I'm aging myself right now, but Min, how about that idea for you? The idea of not adhering to the given form, because you write big, wonderful, Free Food for Millionaires is like the Middlemarch I've been waiting for, my whole life. It's just a Middlemarch being a big touchstone for me. And
it's my favorite book.
There we go.
There you go. That Dorothy is such a dope.
But we could talk about Casey's reading of Middlemarch for such a long time, and we would probably have the best evening. But since you are nodding, at least, to that tradition of the Victorian novel, which was enlarged, enhanced, changed, and Douglas, you are too, but you're using it to your own purposes. Man, I was wondering if you could comment on that as well, on breaking down narrative convention, in your case, mostly by content and character.
Yeah, and message.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So I thought I would figure out how to write the 19th century realist novel. Like I was like, George Eliot, Balzac, just let me try.
Right, exactly.
And publishing said no. And I was like, let me just keep trying. And then finally I just went, you know what, fuck it, I'm just gonna do it anyway. So then I just kept on going, but then I feel so in command of that form. Like I can say that now, I'm 52, I just don't care. Like I've written those 2 books, you can give a test on it. It's actually taught as a way to do that form. And that makes me feel enormous pride because I wasn't even born in America. You know, English is my second language. But then I feel like that was my way of creating the Trojan horse to create the most radical message that in the 19th century novel, the heroine does not have to die, right? Like my female character does not die. She makes lots of mistakes and she does not killed off.
Right, exactly.
You know, Lily dies, right? Lily Bart dies. Anna Karenina dies. You know, Madame, Flaubert's Balzac died. I mean, I'm sorry, Madame Bovary dies. Like everybody dies. And I'm like, you know what, my girl's gonna live.
Jane winds up with a blind, widowed, sort of.
Right. And also in my experience, I've been into so many rooms where people are literally still asking me, I'm 52, how did you get here? What are you doing here? And how do you say your name again? And they still ask me things like, oh, is your book written in translation? I get this all the time. Like, is your book written in translation? Still, all the time. They ask me still at 52 where I went to college. So I wasn't thinking, I mean, I think it's amazing that Tope is significantly younger than I am. I think it's amazing that you can say, you know what, I'm just gonna like play with the form and that'll be my joy. Like, and you should have joy. I mean, I think that, James Joyce had joy in breaking form. And I love Ulysses. I mean, I'm probably like one of the few people I actually liked it. And at the same time, you can also do other things besides Ulysses. But I really wanted to try to use it for my own ends to say something really radical. And my messages are really radical. Pachinko is a really radical, progressive book. And so is Free Food for Millionaires. But it's really fun for me. Like I just recently wrote the introduction for The Great Gatsby for the Penguin Classics reissue. Go figure, right? Go figure. And it was really fun to just like for 6,000 words nerd out and talking about the queer reading of Nick Carraway. Because I said, if you want me to do this for like almost no money, I'm just going to go for it. I'm going to write about the bromance. I'm going to write about the fact that he really messed up white women. And it was such a joyful thing for me because I love being a scholar. And I also love criticism. And I also really, really love research. And I also love trying to figure out how to do something really hard. But my principal goal is the fact that I'm allowed to be me. That's a radical gesture.
I think that is something. I'm going to turn to the questions now and wind up on that because all 3 of you have managed to be you in your books. And that is a radical gesture. And that is why we are here tonight talking about intersectionality. Min, that is a really fantastic segue. And I will, after we talk through some questions, come back and wrap things up. But this is really exciting. There are so many questions here from Rebecca Cha. How do you manage the intersection between your own liminal experience of living in between cultures and expectations and writing characters whose lived experience is drastically different from your own? Does it feel appropriative? What do you do when it does? And I'll let, whichever one of you wants to take that first. I don't know if any of the 3 of you is writing a character whose lived experience is drastically different in all ways, but I'll let you answer.
I think even if you're not, if you're writing a book that you have to sort of, write characters who aren't you and who have different experiences. And that's, I think my approach to it is just, I take in everything, I'm not the kind of, I mentioned before that I love visual art and, my love too of like writers and thinkers like Frantz Fanon and Shoyinka and those folks that I grew up with that my parents were talking about. But I also desperately love, Real Housewives, and I'll watch every episode. And I think that for me, it's important to kind of take in as much of the world, because what is actually happening too, and one thing that I like to do before the world shut down was, I live in DC, I'd go to DuPont Circle, which is this, kind of wonderful, kind of biggish park in the middle of DC, and I'd sit and I'd listen to conversations. And part of the act of being an artist is trying to understand humanity. And there's something to be said, and I certainly do this in my book, for talking about or trying to, depict yourself or some version of yourself on the page. But I think another important part of it too is learning other human beings and getting a sense of how they are in the world. And so that's something that I do appreciate, and something that I really try to do in my work as well.
Anything, Douglas or Min, from you, or shall I move on? Thank you, Tope, very much.
I mean, the only thing maybe I could add to that is because I write about poverty and I write about the limits of poverty, how it keeps my characters on the streets. They know, and they don't get to necessarily see as much of the world as they wanted to. I had to have some restraint with myself as a writer, because obviously my understanding of the world is bigger than that Shuggie would ever have seen.
Mm-hmm.
And I found that I knew very quickly when I was writing my prose or when I was explaining the world, if I was standing at the character's shoulder or if I was standing and watching them. And anytime I felt like I was looking back at them on the page and sort of inviting the reader to look at them, then I was doing the wrong thing. And so sometimes I mean, I can't really say what it made me do. Sometimes it was, I had to consider the references they would understand, or perhaps I would have to simplify my prose or take out arrogance often if I had written a very arrogant sentence that I loved and I thought it was the most beautiful sentence I'd ever written. I had to remember that when I was writing about characters that didn't necessarily see themselves in literature or turn to literature, I didn't want to deny them the access of my book.
Thank you. Let's see, for Min Jin Lee from Melissa Stephan, I gather that you do in-depth research into the historical time and place of your story and interview people who experience the things that happen to your characters. Are there things in Pachinko that might surprise readers to know truly happened?
Almost everything in that book truly happened to multiple people. I mean, I actually spent that book took me almost 30 years to write, because I was working on it off and on. I wrote it before I wrote Free Food for Millionaires, actually. And then I had to throw that away and start again. And I could probably draw a footnote to every sentence, but I won't. So for example, like, yeah, almost every one of those things actually happened to multiple people, and I had to figure out how to make it into composite. I mean, the book is taught in a lot of history and political science classes at undergraduate and graduate level, because the scholars have said it actually does cohere. The hardest thing for me was to try to figure out the sense of responsibility. And I guess I can tie up both questions, this one as well as the last one,
Mm-hmm.
is that I think that you're allowed to show up if you could bring something to the table. And if you can't, you should go home. Like, don't waste anybody's time. Like, I don't really need to hear the sound of my voice. Like, it's fine. but like, I mean, I'm really happy to stay home and read my amazing books. the books I didn't write. So, and I think you like, in the same way, if I bring you a book and I ask you to give me your time, because it's not the $12.99 or whatever, because I make $1 if I sell a copy of Pachinko. Like, I was recently asked to do an event and they were going, I'm going to sell 50 copies. I'm going, it's going to make $50 for me, pal. So that's not working. I mean, do I really believe in the purpose of something?
Would love to have those $50, man.
But I'm only bringing this up because what I'm just trying to say is, I think sometimes what I hear in the question, especially the first person who asked, Rebecca, the question I'm hearing is the anxiety is like, do I have the right to do something? And I'm saying you do if you actually do the work.
Yep.
You do. Like, I don't know what is that you wanted to do, but you have the right to be there if you do the work. And I was really nervous about writing about certain authors I really admire. Like, I've written about bell hooks for the New York Times. I've written about F. Scott Fitzgerald now for Penguin Classics. And I was nervous, but I did the work, and now I'm going, I did a really good job. and I'm being a little, cheeky right now, but I'm doing that on purpose for my young people, because I want them to kind of like take a little space, because they don't see people like me ever taking space. And I kind of think, by the way, I'm in therapy, I'm really nervous, I'm scared as shit. However, sometimes if I do the work, I feel like it's okay to show up.
And if you're bringing something to the table, I think that is such an important thing for all of your readers to hear. You know, that's what we want as readers. We don't want to read a book that's someone talking to themselves. You know, I mean, my dinner with Andre has been done.
I love that movie, by the way, but yeah.
I love that movie. I love that movie, but you know, it is, you know, in a way, but you know, that the movie lets you know that it's people talking about themselves to themselves. Laura Strawn, hello, Laura, says, how do we get past the mindset of we don't know how to market this to get to the readers who are going to champion great fiction?
I think you have to be willing to take risks, you know, like every year a publishing house decides that, you know, certain books will, and it's a kind of vicious cycle. This book did well in the past, so this book, and you see it when, you know, you begin to see the marketing copy. This book is like this, and that. Douglas said something that I thought was really interesting, which is about sort of categorizing his book. And the same thing happened to me. All of a sudden, I was being asked to talk about my novel like an immigration novel. I was like, what? You know, like I was reading the books that I read most often when I was writing my book were probably like, let's see, Counter Life by Roth. I read Kafka, I read Borges. I mean, those are the people I kept on going back to because I was interested in trying to do something different. Mm-hmm. And then they're like, okay, so write about immigration and how this is an immigration novel. And part of it is, Douglas said it perfectly, is the kind of reducing incomprehensible people to something that's more comprehensible. And so I think the important thing is to step out of that, to say, okay, I'm dealing with a full living human being who probably is inspired by all kinds of things and interacts with all kinds of art. And you know, ask the writer, you know, this might sound revolutionary, but what are your interests? What's going on? And then perhaps try to build around that. There's this kind of externally imposed sort of classification system that's happening right now that I think is really problematic, and taking a risk. You know, part of it does involve taking a risk, and I know that's hard to do in a profit-driven world, but I think that if you're willing to do that, that you'll be surprised by what people, because, you know, it's sort of like voting, right? Like one of the things we heard, and I know you said we want to be political here, but allow me just like—
Oh no, please, you can be political.
But the triumphs that happened in Georgia, triumph if you're a Democrat, happened because, you know, there were a number of people who had never voted before who came out to vote, right? And because somebody was specifically talking to them. I think the same thing can happen in publishing. There are a bunch of people who aren't reading right now because they're like, this isn't for me, I don't want to read that. But if you make an attempt to say, like, this is a book that might connect to you in some way, and I know we typically don't market towards you, but check this out, that you'd be surprised by the people who would all of a sudden start taking up books and engaging with books in a way they haven't before.
Well, and I'm going to interrupt before anyone else answers, because Anna Takahashi says, thank you for addressing the publishing piece. In addition to actively seeking out writers with different backgrounds, what else can readers do? And I think that is a great follow-on to what you just said, Tope.
Yeah, absolutely. And so readers do have a responsibility as well to kind of read outside what they generally read. But I don't place, you know, blame is a harsh word here, but I don't place the blame on readers. I do think that publishing houses have to be willing to take risks, have to be willing to pull a Stacey Abrams, you know, reach beyond the expected, you know, readership and reach out to people. I mean, because even take a look at something like Netflix, which I think has done an interesting job. And I have my, you know, sort of critiques of Netflix, but I think they've done a really interesting job of soliciting work from all kinds of different places and putting it on this platform. And some of that work doesn't get marketed the way it should, absolutely. But I think they've done an interesting job of saying, you know, like, if you're not typically a person who sits down to watch television, here's a show that might appeal to you, right? And I think that publishing maybe needs to think about writing and books in a similar way.
Douglas, I'm wondering what you think about what readers can do, especially because although you live in the United States and you are Scottish American, you are familiar with the British or the UK publishing scene in a way that the rest of us might not be. Is there anything, for example, that you know of besides our beloved Big Scottish Book Club with Damien Barr? Is there anything that there helps readers along the lines of this Netflix model that Tope has brought up?
That's a good question. I mean, I will say Shuggie was also seen as the outside of the British publishing industry as well, because it deals with working class families. This wasn't a thing about an immigrant voice in America. This was about who wants to read about people having a tough time.
Right.
And, what shelf does that go on? But I think Tope is totally right. It's, I think the only insight I could probably give is as a man who has spent 25 years running huge fashion brands, I'm very aware of trends and how marketing works and how people sell things on to other people. And what Tope says about the courage and the bravery of doing what you want, there's a disruption to that as well that I think if people can categorize your work and place it in the family tree of other bits of work, that's great. But also there's plenty of space for people who are doing the first thing of something or who are doing the thing that is really outside of the trend. And any writer today should feel encouraged, actually, if their work can't be placed so neatly on the shelf with its predecessors. And so I would take courage in that, because Shuggie, anecdotally, when they were sending around the manuscript, they were like, what is this like? And they were going back to the 1980s to find James Kelman books and Irvin Welsh books in the 90s. And that was their comp for it. And that was, it was a very sobering moment for me, but then look at Shuggie go.
Jennifer Chang says, I was really struck by Min Jin Lee's early comment about always writing community novels, always writing from an omniscient perspective. Audre Lorde was quoted earlier, and she, of course, believes strongly in the idea of a community of women. What do communities mean to you? What does solidarity mean and look like, especially in today's political climate? What, in your opinion, is the role of art in imagining a better future? And I think that's great, Douglas, with what you've, that sort of builds off of what you've just said. Take courage, be different, and imagine a better future. Jennifer, thank you for that question. And so, the role of art in imagining a better future.
I really see no purpose to art except for that. I don't.
Mm-hmm.
I would never be a writer unless I believe that I had a message and something to say that matters. And that may seem insanely grandiose, but I really don't care. Like, I really don't care. And I say that intentionally because I think people in my community, especially my racial, ethnic, gender, blah, 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 all of it, usually aren't walking around saying things like, oh, I have a message and you should listen to me. But I've actually had to do a lot of overcoming to say, you know what, actually, I do believe some things. And if you actually connect with that, thank you. But if you don't, that's okay. I mean, I fight really hard for PEN America because I believe that we have the right to disagree and to have different messages. And two things about this sort of goes back to marketing.
Mm-hmm.
And just because I have all of 2 books and it took me 20 years to publish 2 books. One is, I think you really have to manage your expectations of who your audience is. There is absolutely a marketplace for every writer in America, If your expectation, like for let's say your Substack or newsletter, if 50 people is good, that's fine. If your Patreon followers can give you 100 people, you can actually probably, like have pin money. You can have enough to buy coffee every month. If you want to be a bestseller, that's another tack. If you want to be a prize winner, that's another tack. And I know because I judge. I'm a critic, I'm a judge, I publish, I teach, all those different worlds. I realize like, oh no, you have to manage your expectations. That's one. And 2 is, I do not believe anyone's going to do it for you. I don't. Like, we live in a neoliberal economy. It is winner take all. It's gotten so cruel, actually. And as a matter of fact, for anybody who came out with a book in 2020, in 2019, and 2021, oh goodness. I mean, it is such a difficult time. So one of the things that I think writers can do is, lift each other's books up and go like, hey, I liked it. I mean, whenever I'm asked, I try to go like, I like this. And I try to bring a new person and an old person, especially when I like it. There you go.
Hey.
And we have to do this for each other. So in terms of solidarity, I mean, you guys, like, we're family. Like, we are here for each other. And I think that that does make a difference. And I will either not write a review, but I will never write a bad review as a writer. As a fiction writer, I can't do it. I just can't, because like I know what it's like, and I'm going, oh, I understand why they did that, and I'm kind of glad, because I probably don't want to read that book. But I know it's really tricky, right? But when I get excited about a book, like, I can't be a better megaphone, because I think I want to sell books. I do, because I want us to survive.
Yeah.
And imagine a better future.
Absolutely.
There's so many more questions, and we're not going to be able to get to all of them. But I have one last question. We have 1 minute left. Lisa Page. Hello, Lisa. I love what Min Jin Lee said about intersectionality, opening up her life and opening up opportunity. How do all three of you feel about this idea about intersectionality opening things up for you? And I am so sorry to all the people that we haven't been able to get to questions for. So we'll figure it out. We'll figure it out. But how do all three of you feel about Lisa's question and about this idea?
It's a really important question. I have to say that I guess the first time that I fully felt myself and fully recognized myself is when I sat down and committed to writing about an experience that in so many ways echoed my own. Because I hadn't encountered in literature, the tale of somebody who emerges from poverty and has like sort of severe identity issues and doesn't necessarily see the world the way everyone else does. And more than that, is sort of deeply impacted by this like dual belief systems, one that it's based on logic and adherence to kind of, solving things in a very sequential way, and another that sort of has this spiritual basis, and that spirituality suffuses everything. And so the first place where I could kind of bring all these things together was in the pages of a book. And so for me, that's why books are so desperately important, because they are one of the few places. And I think too, as we talk about the future, that we have an obligation as artists, one, to work on craft so that, you do a good job of getting your ideas out there, but two, insisting on your presence, on the importance of your presence in this space. And that there will be some headwinds, there will be some difficulty, but the thing is that I don't think you want to write towards the center of this moment. I think you always have to be looking towards the future, because that's what in the future, they'll look back towards those folks who were reaching out a hand to them, right? And so that's what I try to do in my writing. I try to reach out a hand to the future to say, I'm somebody from the past, and I'm trying to figure out how we get there. And this is my missive to you. And that, I think, is dangerous and maybe not, the best, most lucrative plan in the short term, but I think in the long term, it makes a great deal of sense, and it helps humanity move forward. So yeah, that's my 2.5 cents.
Thank you. And Min, Douglas, any words to add about reaching a hand out to the future?
I teach at a college, and I love my students, and my next book is about Generation Z. And these are really young, bright, talented, incredibly, also very open-hearted people. So I think whatever we can do to try to not be discouraging, like, I'm so sick and tired of all this dystopia and apocalypse. I'm tired of it. And I think that in a way, I want very much to encourage this next generation to believe in good things and that our decisions matter, even though we do live in a neoliberal economy. And that requires the elders to behave better, to be more decent, to have better messages, and to also give advice. Like, if someone asks me things, I try to tell them if I know something.
Douglas?
Well, I think part of reaching out to the future is first correcting our past and making sure that we set that down in truth. And I feel like as a writer, I'm so keen to bring people to the page that have been left off it historically. And that's just where I'm at right now with my writing journey. And I think that is a forward thinking thing, because you can't just keep erasing people as we go through the world and not hearing the urgency of their lives, and then keep sort of pitching forward, because they'll really truly get left behind. And so right now I'm in a bit of a period of excavation, in the hopes that if I can do that, then the future will be more truthful. I don't know.
I think that is what intersectionality brings, is a commitment to the truth. And all three of you are doing that. Thank you so much, Tope Folarin, Min Jin Lee, Douglas Stuart, for being here with me this evening and talking about the idea of intersections. Thanks to the National Museum of Women in the Arts. And thank you all who've been here. And for those of you whose questions did not get answered, you never know. Stay tuned. I might be able to do something to help out with those. But right now, I need to turn our attention to our executive director at the PEN/Faulkner Foundation, Gwydion Sullivan, and I'm going to say goodbye to everyone else. If we could just mute ourselves and stop our video.
Hello, everyone. I am Gwydion Sullivan, PEN/Faulkner's executive director. Let me start by offering tremendous thanks to all of our incredible guests, and to PEN/Faulkner's own Bethanne Patrick for moderating tonight brilliantly, and also to all of you for making this another incredible literary conversation. We really could not do anything we do without your participation. I wanted to close tonight by dropping our donation link back into the chat window. PEN/Faulkner has continued to stay strong and stay hopeful throughout this whole pandemic. And part of what's given us that hope has been the support that you have given us. You know, books have the ability to help us all bear up under difficult circumstances and keep our lives rich and full, to make sure that we all feel seen in the ways that we are, as the people we are. And that's why we work really hard to put intersectional books into the hands of DC students who don't always have enough access to stories, even in good times, and for whom recent events have been even more difficult on that front. So even $15 from you can totally transform one young person's reading life. And if you can do $15 a month, if you can manage that, it helps us do the same thing over and over again throughout the year and have a really big lasting effect. So thank you so much for anything you can do in support of PEN/Faulkner. And thank you for joining us tonight. We wish you the very best, and we hope you have a really good night.